Okay. So it's just me tonight. We did advertise that it was me and Maggie Zhao, who's my actual co-author on the book I'll tell you about in a little bit. Maggie sends her apologies because unfortunately she's been working in Amsterdam and she is on an aeroplane as we speak, flying back from Amsterdam to Lisbon, where she lives. So it's me representing both of us tonight. So as Claire said, she's invited me to come along and talk about grief, bereavement, grief, loss in coaching. And we will be talking about other things apart from death. So even though I've just given that sensitivity warning, you know, we will discuss other losses as well. So maybe that's something you would like to start thinking about, and thinking about your own work as a coach. What other losses do you think appear in coaching that would give a sense of grief or loss or bereavement for people? If you have some ideas, pop them in the chat box. That will be great, and we'll come back to those, especially as people are still coming onto the call. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit, first of all, about how the book came about so that you can see the journey with this. It actually started in 2018 when my father died. And it was my first proper family loss, really. And what fascinated me was people's reactions to the news of my father's death. And the people who didn't know what to say, the people who didn't say anything at all, and even a best friend who was slightly puzzled that I wasn't as upset as she thought I should be. So the psychologist in me was quite fascinated by this. So I did what we always do, is take to LinkedIn, did a posting and just put my observations about what had been happening and what were people's thoughts about grief and loss. And we had this rich seam of dialogue that appeared with coaches talking about bereavement, grief and loss, and actually just the taboo subject it is, even though it's universal, but also what was coming out was that bereavement shows up in coaching, but none of us had ever really talked about this as coaches and supervisors. And the other thing that came apparent was that there was no literature on it either. So there was plenty for counsellors, but there was nothing for coaching, even though all the coaches and supervisors were saying, but it does show up in coaching all the time. So what are we doing about it? What happens? How do we know what to do about it? Are we doing the right thing? So Maggie was one of those people who responded, and we hadn't met at that point, so we had a chat about our mutual interest, and we were invited to just do a discussion session. We didn't really know that much about bereavement at that point, so we got together, did a webinar, then did an article, then did another webinar, and before we knew it, somebody said, well, why don't you write a book? And so during the pandemic, which wasn't the greatest time to do it, but very apposite in terms of the topic, we wrote the book and we published it, and it launched in October last year. So we believe it's the first of its kind. We're not saying it's definitive, but we feel like we've started the dialogue now, and hope that people will carry this on. And we wanted to really debunk the myth that there's no room for bereavement in coaching, but to help coaches to be a bit more confident about where the line is, where coaching is okay and where perhaps people need a different intervention. So in terms of tonight, I do have some slides, but I also want this to be interactive because I think it's that type of topic. So I think it'd be really good if we can get into a discussion, and have a breakout room, as well as discuss between us. Obviously, as I've just said earlier, please only share what you're comfortable sharing. That might be different in the bigger group compared with a smaller group, and I'll trust you to know when that is. So I'll just share some slides and get started. By the way, if for any reason my regional accent gets in the way of understanding, please check anything that I might say that you don't understand. I appreciate not everybody knows a Midlands accent. Okay. So everybody should be able to see that, I hope. Okay, great. So there's me and Maggie. So in terms of an outline for tonight, we'll get started talking about what do we mean by grief and loss, just defining our terms. A little thought about what the signs and symptoms are of grief, which I'm sure most of you will know. And one of the things that I can always guarantee on a call is that bereavement in its variety of forms has been a part of everybody's life, whether that's through death or other losses. So it truly is a universal topic. So for those of you joining the call late, I was asking people to put into the chat box other losses that they think arrive at coaching, rather than just ones to do with death and dying. The other thing to say as well is that one of the key features of coaching around bereavement, particularly when we talk about death, is the language that you use. So my preference is to use death and dying, and I know that's not everybody's preference. So, but that's what I will do tonight for clarity. But it's a good point when you are actually talking to coaching clients about bereavement, is to actually follow their language and how they use their language. So a lot of people say passed away when they mean that somebody's died, and therefore that's the best language to use with them. So death is all around us, and as Claire said, unfortunately, wars, natural disasters, at a very sort of big level, and also families, it's always there, and how we feel about it can mainly be down to our experience. Our cultural influences have a big impact, and messages from our family of origin. So a nice question to think about is, how was death talked about in your family when you were young? And that's a personal reflection piece for you to think about, and possibly take to supervision. So we'll think about signs and symptoms of grief. The Kubler-Ross change curve, I'd be very surprised if anybody's never seen that before. It's been around a long time, but it's worth revisiting. And then the main bit where we'll go into breakout rooms is to have a think about, what do you do when grief and loss arrives in the coaching room? And of course, it will depend on circumstances, and we'll look at the different circumstances that perhaps might make a difference. And also surface that question, where is the boundary with counselling? Is there a nice, neat boundary? Probably not, but we'll talk about that. And also have a slide which also pulls out some tools that you can use to do some coaching around bereavement, and some of those tools you probably already use, or have perhaps not considered them for grief and loss conversations. And then we'll just have a little bit at the end for any questions. if there's a burning question that you need an answer to, then please feel free to ask if it won't wait. You know, take yourself off mute, put your hand up. Either me or Claire will spot you, or just write it in the chat box if you prefer to do that. Okay, so let's start just with a definition, because I think it seems to be the law that you have to start with a definition. So bereavement is basically the deprivation of something, being robbed of something or something of value. So again, that's the more general essence of loss. So any loss will have some sort of grief attached to it, but often it's associated with death, and that intense emotion that we can feel after the loss of a loved one. And as I say, all grief all loss has some sort of level of grief attached to it. And we can grieve the loss of our identity, our relationships, our health. So just having a quick look at the sort of chat, there was some really good ideas about loss, losing your job, your youth, aging, your health, moving house, countries. Yeah, just looking at what we've got here. Mobility, sight, hearing, illness, colleagues, retirement, all those sorts of things. Yeah, menopause, very good one. We put menopause in the book. Not always a loss thing for everybody, but for many women, it certainly is. Okay, so let's have a think of signs of loss. Not signs of loss, types of loss. So on this side of the screen, we've got probably the losses that most of us would quickly recognise. So death of a loved one is the obvious one there. And death of pets, you know, that's quite a big one, because particularly in the UK, I'm not sure what it's like in other countries, but in the UK, my goodness, we really like our dogs in the UK. I think there's about 12 million dogs, which is a big percentage of our population, which means on a daily basis, there's often somebody grieving the death of a pet. And as we know, the love for an animal, if the love is real, then the grief is real. And that could be, you know, via illness or euthanasia. So even something as simple as that may enter the coaching room. It may not be something that you would pause your coaching for, but it may be something that the client turns up that day and that's what they want to talk about. Health changes, as we know, they can have a big impact on people. Legal, financial problems, they could have loss and grief associated with that. Carer's grief. I think somebody mentioned in the chat about anticipatory grief. That can be sometimes caring for somebody with dementia. There's a lot of anticipatory grief there. A lot of people report feeling that they feel like they've lost the person already, even though they are still alive. So carer's grief can be, you know, very, very, very sad. Menopause we've mentioned, infertility too, the loss of what could have been. That may show up explicitly or implicitly in coaching. And you might only find out that when you are just doing a general biographical inquiry with someone. Redundancy, being fired, all those sorts of things. I would suspect that one is probably the number one that we get in coaching, loss of job, because a lot of coaches work with career outplacement, career transition. So it's seeing that as a loss topic rather than just seeing it as a I need to help this person with their CV and get another job. It's about working with the emotions that are attached to that as well. Aging, yeah, the loss of youth. Aging creates existential questions about our own deaths and our own mortality. So that's a loss too. Divorce and separation, I would guess, also are big topics that come up in coaching, because, you know, alongside job loss, they're probably very, very common. And family estrangement, lost custody of children, that type of thing. On the other side of the screen, we've got things that look ostensibly like happy events, but they may have loss attached to them as well. And it's about tuning your radar to see that there is loss sometimes attached to those. So even for the empty nester, they may have been desperate for their children to grow up and fly the nest and leave home, and then be devastated and surprised at how empty they feel when the children have actually gone. So that can be a big, big loss topic. Identity change, gender transition, there's a loss and a gain there, and some grief attached. Moving house is an interesting one, and somebody put that in the chat, whether that's just moving down the road or moving to another town or a country. Moving house can be very disruptive, particularly for children. So you might be working with a coachee whose children are struggling, and therefore you are coaching that system. Or it could be that loss is triggered from the past, and it could well be that you find out from your client that they moved a lot when they were a child. So their parents may have been in the forces, or they may have gone to boarding school away, and therefore there are lots of trauma with a big T, or trauma with a small t, sometimes with moving. Marriage, there's loss attached to marriage. Yeah, as happy as it might be, you are losing your single life and all that entails. Same with graduation, moving from one stage to another. Retirement, exactly the same. Anything where there's a life transition, there will be losses and gains. Holidays, that can bring up mixed feelings. Having a baby can also generate feelings of loss, on top of grief at feeling loss, guilt at feeling loss, and adoption as well. So it's interesting to see that actually there's quite a lot of things that could turn up in coaching under those headings. And it's looking at those and going, are there some that I would be perfectly happy working with, others that make me a little bit more nervous? Okay. So signs and symptoms of grief and loss. I expect hardly any of those as a surprise. And also, you could say some of those signs and symptoms can be attached to other things. So we always have to be careful with how we view our clients and what things we are seeing in their behaviour. Menopause, for instance, you know, there's a list of, well, must be about 100 different symptoms for menopause, and a lot of those are very, very similar. Just draw your attention to the bottom one, because sometimes that's, we notice that when people seem to have an overreaction, and I've put that in inverted commas, because that's just that could be a judgmental thing about whether we think somebody's overreacting. But it could well be that loss is not a big loss, but it's triggering something perhaps from the past that is unfinished, or something that a person had a handle on, but now something's been generated just for them. So what I'm saying is just because somebody's highly emotional, it doesn't make them a special case, or that there's some sort of mental illness wrong. It could be that it's just a temporary reaction to something that's happened. So in the book, for instance, we talk about we have lots of case studies in the book written by other coaches. And one of those stories is about a coachee who comes to the coaching session, and she's in floods of tears because one of her staff, she's a manager, has gone on maternity leave and has unfortunately had a stillbirth. And the coachee also lost a baby many years ago. And now this is stirred up a lot of issues for her, and it's very easy then to panic a little bit and think, oh my goodness, this person needs to have counselling or go back to counselling that they've had before. But in the case study, we see that actually just talking to the person and helping them to remember what they learned in counselling, some of the tools and techniques that they learned then, how they can bring them into today, basically. Just a normal reaction, and that could happen to anybody. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong and that you need to close the coaching down and push your client elsewhere. So as promised, I said I'd just quickly go through the Kubler-Ross change curve, because I'm sure it's very familiar. It's been around since the 1960s, and it was originally a 5-stage bereavement curve. And then interestingly, it's got co-opted into the corporate world as a change curve. So I find that most managers are completely familiar with this curve because they've seen it in managing change courses and hadn't realised that it came from bereavement. So it just shows that connection between changes in our lives and bereavement. David Kessler, who was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's co-author at the time, he's written a new book only a couple of years ago called The 6th Stage of Grief, and that's about finding meaning and purpose. So if you haven't seen that and you're interested, it's a very good book because it's about, you know, the other side of grief and finding meaning and purpose, you know, after the death of a beloved one. Some people would also say that there might be anxiety missing in this, somewhere where in this that you do see anxiety, and also it's not linear. So Kubler-Ross was very keen to point out that you don't go through this in nice, neat stages. And sometimes when I've talked to clients about this, it's almost like they're getting stressed because they haven't got to the next stage yet. And sometimes you can get stuck in one particular stage for years or circle round again, and you know, go back up the curve and go round again. So there's no neat time scales, and it's not linear. Everybody moves through grief in a different way. So it's universal, but it's individual at the same time. Okay, so I feel like I've talked enough for the time being, and I'd really like you guys to talk to each other for a little bit and start to think about this topic for yourselves as coaches. So I'm going to ask Claire to play with all the buttons and put you into breakout rooms, and we've got some questions there for you to think about. So if loss shows up in the coaching room, what would you do? what do you do? What do you think you should do? And by that same token, is there anything that you feel that you shouldn't really do? So what not to do? And there might not be a right or wrong answer here. So sharing that with each other. And also at the same time, does that lead you to think about where the line is between therapy and coaching when we're talking about bereavement? Okay. So how are we doing for time? We're doing okay. So how about shall we aim between 10 and 15 minutes, Claire? Shall we go for, let's go for 12 minutes and then
Okay,
see how we get on. Is that all right?
sure. And I'm going to press send now. So everyone's got someone, so that's good.
Okay, great.
No worries, Emma, don't worry. She's driving.
Oh, right. Goodness, yeah. Let me just take that off and then this feels a bit weird.
It's an interesting thing with self-management as well, isn't it, when it triggers things in you?
Yeah, I mean, we won't get time to cover that, but another webinar that I've just done recently was very much about the bereaved coach. Yeah.
Yeah. So Garda said she was coming late, and here she is. And I'll see if she wants to join.
To go into breakout room. Yeah.
Hi Garda, how are you?
Hello, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, shukran jazilan.
Thank you. Happy to see you again.
You too. So Garda, people have just gone into breakouts for 12 minutes. Should we put you in a breakout with them?
Ah, okay. Okay.
Okay.
So I'll just
one
catch up. Okay, thank you.
See you shortly. There we go.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, we've got a whole chapter in the book called The Bereaved Coach. So and there's a lot in there about self-care. So if you ever wanted me to come back and do another one.
Absolutely, yeah, fabulous topic.
Yeah.
I'll just press pause as well. Forgetting. There's some more to come back, I believe. As if by magic, they all appear. Over to you, Julia. Great,
that's great. We've had some more people join us. I think some joined the breakout rooms and some not. So let's see what we've got. Let's have a chat, a discussion about what sort of things emerged in your group about loss in all its forms showing up in coaching session, and particularly perhaps bereavement, if we focus on that, because I'm guessing that that's where sometimes people are unsure and have less confidence in that, and what you think we should be doing as coaches, and what we shouldn't be doing as coaches, and then that can take us into is there a line between coaching and therapy when it comes to bereavement, and do we know where that line is? Can we place the line somewhere? So I'm looking to all you lovely people to say who would like to just get us started and just share something that's emerged for them. So just take yourself off mute, give us a wave.
I'm happy
Sharon.
to start the process. In our conversation, I shared a situation that happened when I was a very new coach, and a client came in, and about 10 minutes into the conversation, he said, "My father was murdered on the weekend." And I was completely shocked. And it sounds, so I think there's that difference between a peaceful dying, if you like, and a violent situation, and then having this corporate individual who, by all accounts, should be out there with his family, but he's shown up for coaching. Yeah, so that was, I didn't know then what I know today, and I probably would have handled it very differently, but I don't know if I would have been able to conceal the horror or the shock of such a piece of news.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us Sharon. And I guess it raises quite a number of different things there. There's almost there's your own shock to deal with, and that we are human beings. One of the things that we won't get time to look at tonight is a chapter that we have in the book that's just called The Bereaved Coachee, and sometimes being aware of your own triggers if somebody brings grief and loss into the space and triggers something for you. The other thing as well is there's almost sometimes an unspoken hierarchy of grief. So if somebody mentions the death of a child, for instance, that almost seems to trump other deaths. Or if you know the death of somebody and they were 100 years old, people's reactions will be different than if it was somebody younger, or if it was somebody who took their own life or died in violent circumstances. So we all have these judgments and hierarchies in our heads playing out. You know, I've written a book on bereavement, but I've been in a webinar where somebody said to me that their husband, their son had been murdered, and I thought, even I don't know what to say. There's something about being kind to yourself and compassionate in that moment. And as you say, Sharon, you'd probably do something differently, and have a think about whether both of you should be there at that moment in the session. Yeah. But we'll come back to that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I just quickly want to add, and I think you absolutely, you captured it. Some situations, there are no words.
No.
We simply don't have words. And we can only be.
Exactly. Yeah, certainly. Okay, thank you for getting us started. Any other thoughts? Anybody else like to go next?
Well, I wasn't in the breakout, but I always been trained in counselling in the past. I always see it as, yes, the past may be mentioned, and it's what's here and now, and enabling people to be able to move into the future, and that bit's the coaching bit. So I'm curious about your thoughts around that, Julia. And if they keep going, the past is obviously here or here as well, isn't it, off the page? But if they keep going into the past, I always see that as a trigger that some, to be blunt, fixing or healing's needed, maybe as well as or instead of coaching.
Yeah, and I like the phrase here and now. I think sometimes what's happening in the here and now is being triggered from there and then. So that's something to be aware of. In my next slide, I'll talk about the different scenarios, because I think, a bit like Sharon's example, it depends when a bereavement happens and where we are in the coaching cycle, as it were, where we are in the coaching program. I think that makes a difference. Isabel, did you put your hand up before? I wasn't sure whether.
I tried to speak and then I realized I was on mute.
Would you like to share something?
Maybe in addition to, so I was with in the group with Raka and Khada, and please, if I omit or if I share something wrong, correct me. Feel free to do that. So in addition to what has been said so far, we also mentioned that for the limit, if at a certain stage you realize that the client is not able anymore to function properly in his daily life, then for me the line is very clear. And then in that case, I would share in the most kind possible way my observation and see how the client recognize that or not, and to really accompany that client. If I really see that the client is not functioning properly, that's I insist on that, really accompany the client, knowing that the decision to consult another type of support, therapy, doctors, whatever, is his decision and not mine.
Yeah, yeah.
And then recently, and I'm very interested in your experience and advice, recently I have been told by a coach who is also a psychotherapist. She said, never mention health practitioner or therapist because you can freak out your client, depending where in the context and so on. And I was thinking, oh yes, so how to handle that? That's also something for me is not clear.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. Some really nice points there, and I have a model for you later on that is not mine. I'm sort of sharing it, but it speaks to what is normal and where is the client not functioning. And I think if it starts to leak into other areas of their life, day to day, and dominates and takes over, then that isn't normal grief. Yeah, grief is a normal part of our world, but it's when it becomes prolonged and more complicated, then that's when it isn't necessarily right, we stop coaching. We always have a decision about whether to continue coaching, pause it, or stop it completely. We'll talk about that in a little while. I'm not sure I agree with the never mentioning any health practitioner, because I think sometimes we can be a bit too vague with our clients. So if you say, what support do you have around you? Sometimes they might not necessarily know what you mean. And people who are grief-stricken don't think very well. So I don't think there's any harm saying, you know, is it something that you would like to go and see your doctor about? Or somebody else who has more expertise than I have as a coach. Just to sort of plant that idea in their head that that's allowable. But obviously we're not there to diagnose. We are not there to go, I think you have some sort of issue, mental illness here, prolonged grief complex, and this is where you should go. That's not our role. Even if instinctively we know that the person might be better off with counselling, it's not our job to say, this is what I think. Because it's very much their role. So we've got a couple of hands up there, Sinanda and Yasmin. Sinanda, you're off mute. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay, so I have a couple of follow-up questions to that, Julia. One is that if we feel that a client will benefit more by having, somebody with more expertise, help them out. And so would that be fair to say, for instance, in terms of grief, that, that I am maybe not, the right person, and you might benefit more with the support of a grief counselor, and I would be happy to recommend somebody in case I know someone that is. Would that be a fair thing to say? The second thing that I wanted to check was that, sometimes we get triggered, and especially during COVID, because there were losses all around, right?
Oh, yeah.
Most of us were triggered, right? And in that scenario, it kind of becomes tad bit difficult to understand whether, it's my trigger or the client's trigger, A. Secondly, would they just benefit? It could be that, I may not be able to handle, but another coach might, right? So where I'm getting at is when to say that it's a coach that you need or a therapist, because I am myself triggered and I am not being able to deal with this right now.
Yeah, okay. I suppose if you think that coaching would still be okay, that's the first decision, but it's not you, then passing on to another coach is fine. If you think actually coaching should be paused or stopped, then a counsellor, if you've got a name or you've got somebody, or you can provide web links or whatever, it's still about giving the responsibility to that person. That's all you can do. It's still up to them to go and find, find something else. The other thing I would say is that sometimes the therapist will advise them to stop coaching anyway. So once they've contacted a counsellor, then the counsellor may say, I actually think it's a good idea if you just stay with me for the time being and think about coaching later, particularly if the coaching's to do with work and work being paying. That might, that might make a difference in terms of the contracting. Somebody said to me only yesterday, a fellow supervisor, he said he always gets in writing from the counsellor that that's what's happening. And I said, really? I've never done that. But he said that he thinks that's a really, really good best practice. So everybody knows where they are in this. Of course, you can run counselling and coaching side by side. So if somebody's going to have some grief counselling and it's not necessarily going to impact coaching, because they may be working on team objectives or something very specific at work, and the grief is not that that all pervasive, then it could well be that you run both side by side anyway. But that isn't your decision. Ask the client, what do they want to do? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think being triggered yourself is a really good call. Me and Claire were talking about it before, and we don't have time to cover it tonight, but there's a whole chapter in the book called The Bereaved Coach, and it's thinking about what's your own story and examining your own story. It isn't necessarily when somebody dies. So an example I had where one of my supervisees came to me and her father had just been given a terminal diagnosis of lung cancer. And she didn't know how long this was going to be. He was obviously going to have some sort of treatment or palliative care, but she was shocked. She was devastated. She didn't feel like she could work today or tomorrow. But then she was thinking, well, what about next week and the week after? I've got bills to pay. My dad has not died yet. So what do I do next week with next week's clients? And so we talked about how she might manage that, and what would happen if she was triggered in the session. And she went to she cancelled her work for that week. And then the following week, her very first client on that Monday morning, it had been the day after Mothering Sunday. And she just asked the client, how are you? Like we do as coaches. And the client said, oh, I'm feeling a bit low. My mother only passed away last year and Mothering Sunday is difficult for me. And the coach, my supervisor, felt herself wobbling a little bit, thinking, oh my goodness. But she decided to share it with her client. And she said that was amazing. She said it created such a strong bond between us. Now, that wouldn't necessarily work with all clients, and she made a judgment call then. But she said, rather than panicking that I'd got to keep it in, she says, obviously I wasn't weeping and wailing. She says, but I was sharing some vulnerability with my client. She says, and it made such a huge difference that it really transformed our work.
So Julia, just one quick question to that then. What is the best way to tell the client that, you know, I mean, obviously you won't say that you are triggered, but the fact is that you currently are not maybe in a place to continue with the session, right? It could be that I could be fine for the next session. So how does one best address that without maybe arousing some kind of not fear, but some kind of anxiety on clients?
Yeah. What if you were physically ill? How would you get out of a coaching session if you became physically ill? What would you say?
I'm unwell.
Yeah, I'm not feeling well today. I can't give you my best. I really want to make sure you get value from the session. If you don't mind, could we reschedule it? You know, and I think it's making sure that we you know, we're not frightened of anything that is emotional or of a mental health status. When if we were physically ill, we'd probably have no problem telling the client that we couldn't work that day. And of course, we have a commitment in our ethical code to be fit to practice. So we could also mention that. Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yasmin, you've patiently had your hand up.
Yeah, but I'm learning. Yeah, only what you have just mentioned, I was just like having notes from the previous class. Because of that reason, I came late. All of us, what you have mentioned, are just like written by me, notes in the previous my class, and answering what's her name, Sunanda. Just be honest with the client. Just be honest. Yeah, my question to you is not a question about the referring to a psychotherapist. We just have to be honest in the discovery session. Why we do discovery session? In the discovery session, we tell the clients that at some point, if we find these blah, 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 like sleeping a lot, not sleeping, eating a lot, or suicidal thoughts, many of these, what do they call them? Things that appear to us, that we have the right to refer them, or sometimes we can call the police if they are serious about their suicidal thoughts. So referring to the idea of the referral to a psychotherapist and to normalize it, saying it in a friendly way, not just like, oh my God, you have this, it's not my expertise, you have to be referred. No, we say to the client, without, we are still with them in the journey. Every time they feel that they need to talk or just like that, we will be following up with them. But what you are just saying is not in my experience. I love to be with you in this journey, but what you are experiencing, it's not in my expertise. I'll be like referring you to a psychotherapist who I work with, so that they build this connection with us and the trust, and yeah, go for it. And they decide if they go or not. We don't force, we just like introduce the idea, and from there, either they go or not, it's up to them. We don't force them. But if it is so serious, no, we have to take them to psychotherapy.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point there, that in our contracting, we should be having or even before contracting, in the discovery session, as you say, having a health and well-being question as standard with all clients, so that you are asking them, is there anything I need to know about your physical or mental health? They might not tell you, but if you know, then at least you can make a decision on whether they're coachable at this time. Yeah. Also, your confidentiality agreement will also pick up self to harm or others, and that you have a duty of responsibility as part of your practice to refer them on elsewhere. if needs be. So that should all be there in the mix. So as we know, people forget things that you've told them at the beginning, but at least then you can refer back. Yeah. So I'm gonna move us on because I'm conscious of the time. So if I share slides again, and let's just talk about the scenario where just look at that. So here's different scenarios, because it depends when the coaching arrives, the bereavement arrives. So what do you do when the bereavement appears at different times of the coaching process? And I think that makes a huge difference. I think we forget that bereavement just happens out of the blue sometimes. So Sharon's example spoke to the fact that the client just arrived in coaching and just announced this. And actually, what was he even doing in work? Why was he even working? So there's a conversation there to be had about why is he even in work. So as a coach, you can have that conversation with him. You can find out what the bereavement policies are. What does he know about the bereavement policies? Because certainly in the UK, it's been shown that well over 50% had no idea that their company had a bereavement policy. So I've got 4 different scenarios there. The first 2 are when you find out the news of your bereaved client outside of the coaching session, or you perhaps halfway through the programme, you've already started with them. That's different, I think, than when it actually appears in the coaching room unexpectedly. So you've got a coaching session with them, they arrive and they tell you something. So the first 2, the news arrives by the coachee that they're not in work for the bereavement. So that might have happened to quite a number of you. So they drop you an email, they phone you up and they say they can't attend their next session because there's been a bereavement, say in the family. That's probably the most common one, and that's probably easier for you to deal with. It's very much the continue, pause, stop is very much the pause. And then that's down to you then to communicate with your client that condolences and about, it's fine, please get back to me when you're ready. Finding out how long they're off from work, if it's a corporate contract that you have. And that's almost quite a straightforward way of dealing with the bereavement. The second one might be that your coachee doesn't tell you about the bereavement. You find out perhaps from the organisation or the line manager that your coachee is not in work because of a bereavement. So that requires you then to ask questions, because how long is the person going to be off work? Is this going to impact on the coaching contract? In some scenarios, the person leaves work, they never come back again because it's something very, very major. But at that time, the organisation or the line manager may not have that information. Or there could be some complexity around the death, which requires them to be off for a long period of time. So maybe the bereavement is in another country, and your coachee has got to travel. So they may be away for quite a while. But at the same time, you can have a conversation with the organisation and line manager about your ability to contact them, whether you should contact them or not. You might want to, as a human being, you may want to contact your coachee to give your condolences and to reassure them that if and when they come back to coaching, that's fine. But you can take your lead from the organisation and they'll tell you what the situation is. I think the other 2 are the ones that are perhaps the ones that most people think about. So unexpectedly in the coaching session, somebody arrives and it's a new and recent loss, but the client is still in work. Now, I think Sharon's example was very unusual, and that person shouldn't have even been at work. But I think if a person is still in work and they're coming to coaching, then that tells you something in itself. And so as a coach, it's asking questions. You have the skills. You already know how to listen, ask questions, show empathy, find out what's going on, rather than panic at the first sign of the word bereavement and think, oh no, I can't deal with this. You don't know what this is. So you need to check that out, because it could well be that it is a bereavement, a family bereavement, but the person is still going to function, and they're only going to have a day off for the funeral. And it could well be that they actually want to use the coaching session to talk about changes, things, that actions they want to take. Some clients want to be very action focused. They may want help with disposing of a beloved person's belongings, so some practical help there. So that's if it's new and recent and doesn't look complicated because they're in work. The other one, which we've touched on, is that sometimes it can happen in the coaching session because something's been triggered from a previous loss. And it could be they're aware of what that is, like the scenario that I mentioned about the lady who'd had a miscarriage and one of her staff had had a stillbirth. Then that's coming into the coaching session. So you dealing with that, again, it's staying with it long enough to find out, what is this? Is it complicated? Does it just require this person for me to listen to them in an empathetic way? And then we decide a course of action at the end, depending on what they want to do, as well as your own judgment on that. So this next slide really sort of summarizes that and thinks about where the line is. And I would say, don't back off, don't panic and back off too soon, because you don't know what the situation is. So find out what's going on for your client. And as I say, all coaches have the skills already: silence, presence, listening. So use those to find out what your client wants. Of course, counselling and coaching both explore personal issues and raise self-awareness and can be goal directed. So there isn't a clear dividing line. But some of the things that you might want to think about is, was your client basically well before this bereavement happened? What were they like before? If they were really struggling before, and they were struggling with work-life balance, there were all sorts of things going on, maybe their marriage was falling apart, they were just about to be made redundant, then that may be a little flag for you to just check out how are they coping with this, because it could well be that on its own, this bereavement may not disturb them ordinarily, but on top of everything else that's going on, it may not be helpful. And of course, we all react differently. So just because somebody's crying doesn't mean to say they are seriously emotionally distressed. By the same token, if they don't cry, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not bereaved. One of the things I noticed when my father died, I wasn't that close to him, so I wasn't classically bereaved. But what I did notice, and only afterwards, was that I had a sort of brain fog, and my memory was not good for about a month. And luckily, I wasn't working. It was over the summer, so I wasn't working much at that time. And I think it was mainly to do with handling the funeral, handling the estate, handling my mother and her grief, and my sister and the changing dynamic. That was my bereavement, not the loss of my father per se. So everybody's different. Have a recontracting conversation with your client. So it could be that you do recontract and have a pause and come back, or you stop it completely depending on what's happening. And maybe they do need to go and see somebody else. Again, it depends on the bereavement and the death. In the book, we have somebody whose sister and brother-in-law died in a car crash, and the two children were now going to become illegal in the legal custody of the coachee, and it looked like she wasn't going to be able to do her job anymore. She had two children to look after who she wasn't expecting. So sometimes people's lives can change quite radically. So recontracting is definitely the way to go. And consider functional, dysfunctional suffering and possibly mental health issues. And I think that was Isabel who talked about is your client functional at the moment? And this is a great book. It's not been updated for a while, but it's great to think about what is normal. And they do a really good Venn diagram that says there's a big overlap between functional suffering, whereby we're suffering, we feel emotion, but it's normal. And bereavement is a perfect example of that, is that we would expect people to have some sort of reaction to bereavement, but they're functioning. It's functional suffering. It's not interfering with their day-to-day work. They can still do the majority of the things that they always did, their activities. They're still getting their children ready for school. But, they might be sad. Dysfunctional suffering is what I talked about before, is that it started to, excuse me, invade a lot of their work. So they can't think about anything else. They can't concentrate. They've got a lot of the signs and symptoms that we talked about earlier. And then, excuse me, mental illness. And this is where we don't have to diagnose. And the booklets say it's not your decision. You only have to decide whether to continue coaching, pause coaching, or stop coaching. And if you think, actually, I don't feel that this person is well enough to be in coaching at the moment, and trust your instincts and trust your competence. Or you may feel that actually coaching might be okay, but they might need somebody more senior than me. Then you get advice. And obviously go to your supervisor. You don't have to make that decision on your own. So just a final slide here before we sort of go into questions. Just a very few basic activities and tools that some of you probably already use for different things. This is laid out on the bereavement curve, so you can actually see that a lot of the things that you use in coaching, you can use with your clients at different stages. And in the back of the book, in part 3, we've got lots of different activities that you can use with clients, and like full details of how to use them. So I think you'll get a copy of these slides from Claire anyway, so you can have a look at those. And so finally, just onto the resources. Those are some of the book I mentioned about David Kessler. There's the Buckley's book on coaching and mental health. It's a very good, excellent book, that is. And our book that I've been referring to. So we can put that link into chat box as well, but it's there in the slides. There's also a podcast there that I did about supervision, and this Self-Care for Coaches webinar that speaks to this whole thing about if you're triggered as a coach. I'd really recommend that, because that's excellent for thinking about, right, what should I be taking care of for myself in order to be fit for practice with my clients. If you want to buy the book, there's a link there directly to Routledge, and there's currently a 20% discount. I checked it last week. It's in pounds, it's £29.99, and then if you take the 20% off, it's £23.99. If you're in the UK, I can get you a cheaper one, but you'll need to email me, and I can only post them out in the UK because of the postage, I'm afraid. So that's it. Any questions? I'll just stop the share. So any sort of final thoughts, observations, things that are bubbling up for you now?
Bless you. I've got an observation. I know many of you attend a number of Coach Me community cafes through the year, and the observation is I'm really curious why everyone on this call is women.
Ooh. Mm.
So I'll stay with that curiosity.
Does anybody want to hazard a guess? Just putting the book there in the chat. I wonder whether, you know, there's a lot more female coaches than there are males anyway. So, but actually, I've noticed that on all webinars, Claire. We perhaps get one or two men, but very, very interesting. And in the book, we talk about menopause as being one of the lost topics, and then we have a separate little thing about men and menopause, and we also have a section about females who lose babies as part of the loss, and then a section underneath that says, you know, males and baby loss, and looking at the gender differences between how men react to more emotional topics. And certainly with menopause, when I raised it with some of my male coaches, you know, it's like it's a brave man who would ask in a health and well-being question discovery session with a female client, how are you getting on with the menopause? But it could be a really, really significant question. You know, instead of helping them to tackle, you know, confidence and poor self-esteem and anxiety, it could well be that that's actually the menopause, and men may think that, well, a woman would know, wouldn't she, if that was it? Well, not necessarily, particularly if they're younger women as well. So I think it's we one of the reviewers was a man, Patrick Hobbs. He's on the back of the cover, and he was being very open about the loss of his child, and he gave us some really, really good pointers and feedback to change that section about men and particularly child loss, because it can be much more complicated because of that the taboo aspect of grieving. Yeah, but yeah, great observation, Claire. So any other sort of thoughts or burning questions that you have before we all sign off?
Well, Julia's on LinkedIn. Have you put your email in the chat as well, Julia?
I'll put my email in.
Yeah, just in case
I'll do that
people,
while you're talking.
You know, because Julia does coaching on this area as well, so that's always a useful resource, whether it's for us or our clients. Thank you so much. Really, really, it's a brave topic, I feel. So, you know, thanks for writing the book and doing all your research. Thank you everyone for joining us. The next community cafe is Dr. Lawrence Brown, and he's doing we send you a coaching recording that you listen to in advance, and then he's doing a live mental coaching session, with the real coach of that recording. So that's on the 1st of March. That's always well attended and an interesting one to watch. So thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Claire, for inviting me, and thank you for everybody coming along, giving your time, and asking such great questions earlier. It's been an honour. Thank you.
Fabulous. See you soon.
Okay. Take care. Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Julia. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Claire. It's been a pleasure and a joy to work with you. And as I say, if you want me to come along and do another bit of it.
Yeah. So I know we've got people to October. They're not all on the website yet, Overkill. I don't think we'll choose December. Maybe November. Oh, what's in, there's something in November around that topic, I think. I'm going back to my Catholic upbringing there. Is it All Saints or All Souls? Something in November.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so maybe November, or if that doesn't fit,
or next year. Yeah,
next year.
fine. Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah. I should still be here, I hope. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. It's been good. I've enjoyed
Great.
it.
And I'll get in touch as well.
Okay. Take care.
See you soon. Bye
Bye for
bye.
now. Bye.